3. The Executive Branch. Chapter 8, the Presidency. Our chapter objectives describe the requirements for the office of President and the role of Vice President, discuss the historical foundations of the Electoral College and its advantages and disadvantages, evaluate how politics influences cabinet appointments and relationships, and describe the components of the executive office of the President. Section 1, President and Vice President. The duties of the President. Presidents have enormous power and responsibility in government. Presidents make sure that the national laws are fully executed. So they serve as Commander-in-Chief of the Armed Forces, appoint top officials, federal judges, and ambassadors, and meet with the heads of foreign governments. The President's term and salary. The 22nd Amendment limited presidents to 2 terms and a maximum of 10 years. Congress determines the President's salary, $400,000 beginning in 2001. And in addition, many benefits are provided for presidents while in office and in retirement. Presidential qualifications. The constitutional requirements. A candidate must be a natural-born citizen, at least 35 years old, and a resident of the United States for 14 years. Experience in government is an unwritten but important qualification. Candidates for office must have access to sources for raising large amounts of money in the presidential election campaign. Successful presidential candidates usually hold moderate political beliefs. Most presidents have shared similar backgrounds, ethnic, economic, racial, and gender. Being president underscores personal strengths and weaknesses. Presidential succession. The 25th Amendment established the order of succession to the presidency, which is Vice President, first in the line of succession, then Speaker of the House, President pro tem of the Senate, the Secretary of State, and then other cabinet members, and spelled out what happens when the vice presidency is vacant. The 25th Amendment also set forth rules to be followed if a president becomes disabled. The Vice President's role. The Vice President's work depends on what jobs, if any, the President assigns. Although presidents before Eisenhower generally ignored their Vice Presidents, presidents since have tried to give their Vice Presidents more responsibility. The National Governors Association helps the state's governors solve common problems. By joining together, they become active in national policy making. The states are obligated to conduct and pay for all elections of federal officials and to consider the ratification of constitutional amendments under the Constitution. The courts as umpire. The Supreme Court and the federal courts settle disputes between the states and the national government. The Supreme Court has supported the supremacy of the national government. Section 2, electing the President. The original system. The President and the Vice President are elected by electoral votes in the Electoral College rather than by popular vote. Originally, the candidate with the most electoral votes would become President, and the candidate who received the second highest number of electoral votes would become Vice President. In the election of 1800, it produced a tie which was eventually settled by the House of Representatives. Specifically in this case, what the situation was is that the Constitution had not taken into account political parties. They had made no plan, really, for having political parties. And so the Democratic Republicans, of which Thomas Jefferson was the party leader, ran Thomas Jefferson in that election, and he selected Aaron Burr as his running mate. And what ended up transpiring is that every elector that cast a vote for Jefferson cast a second vote for Aaron Burr. Now, with the idea of avoiding ties, they gave all of the electors 2 electoral votes. thinking that that would prevent there from being a problem. But being that every single elector that voted for Jefferson also cast a vote for Burr, they ended up tied in the Electoral College. When there's a tie in the Electoral College, it goes to the House of Representatives, and they will vote to settle it. Unfortunately, many of the opposing parties' members in Congress, particularly we're talking the Federalist Party in this election of 1800, many of them preferred Burr to Jefferson, and ultimately what happened is they ended up voting, I think it was like 36 times in the House before finally Jefferson won by a single vote. So since then, they have changed this with the 12th Amendment, which was added in 1804, and this required separate ballots for president and vice president. So the electors still get 2 votes, but they get one for president, one for vice president now. So the modern system. Under the modern Electoral College, all states, except for Maine and Nebraska, use a winner-take-all system, which means the candidate who has the most popular votes in a state takes all of the state's electoral votes. Now, of course, that doesn't always hold true, because the Electoral College is always held at a later date, and you could always have a disloyal elector, although that rarely happens. Presidential elections take place every 4 years on the first Tuesday after the first Monday in November. And that might sound a little confusing, but literally what it means is that if the first falls on a Tuesday, it will not be that Tuesday, it would be the second Tuesday. So in other words, it's going to be between the 2nd of November and the 8th. So it's the first Tuesday after the first Monday, or the day after the first Monday in November would be Election Day. The Electoral College vote is cast in December. Electoral College issues. Some critics say that the winner-take-all system is unfair. For example, if you look at the state of California, we have 55 electoral votes presently. Well, that by far is the largest number of electoral votes. However, a candidate that wins the state, even by a narrow margin, takes all 55 electoral votes. And it doesn't really tell you how close the vote was within the state. It is possible for a third-party candidate to take enough electoral votes to prevent any candidate from receiving a majority of the electoral votes. It is also possible for the candidate who wins the electoral vote to not be the candidate who receives the most popular votes. In fact, that has happened in the 2000 presidential election. For example, Al Gore received the most popular votes by a very narrow margin, and George W. Bush ended up winning the most electoral votes, also by a very narrow margin. Now, most of the time, the candidate that wins in the Electoral College also wins the popular vote, but on rare occasions, this can occur. Critics of the Electoral College have offered suggestions to improve it, and some have suggested that we abandon it and elect the president and vice president directly. Although, even though some have suggested it, so far nobody really has pushed that hard, and so the present system has remained virtually unchanged. So this is what I was talking about, the 2000 presidential election. These were your candidates. Al Gore, who was the vice president at the time, and Texas Governor George W. Bush were running against each other. Election troubles. On election night, before the polls were closed on the West Coast, the media was projecting Al Gore as the winner. A short time later, they revised their call and projected Bush as the winner. The election came down to the state of Florida. Whichever candidate took Florida would win the election, and the election was close in Florida. Late in the evening, it was announced that George W. Bush had won the election, and as news crews waited for Gore's concession speech, it was announced that Gore was not conceding. There were numerous problems with the voting, and Gore was requesting recounts in select counties in Florida. Ballot problems. Here's an example of the punch card ballot that was used in Florida. The punch card ballots used in Florida could lead to several problems with regards to interpreting the will of the voter. For example, if you look at this punch card ballot, here you can see the Republican candidate, George W. Bush, and Vice President Dick Cheney listed on the ballot, and there's an arrow pointing to a hole. This is a hole that you would punch if you were voting for the Republican candidate. Then, over here on the other side, you see at the top the Reform Party candidate of Pat Buchanan, and with Izola Foster as the vice presidential nominee, and here's another hole. And this hole would be the hole that you would use for the Reform Party. Then you move to the Democratic with Al Gore and Joe Lieberman, and here's the hole you would punch for them. And then, so really, as you go down, these holes are alternating back and forth. It would be very easy for somebody to look at this, look over on this side and see the first hole for the Republican and second hole for the Democrat and punch right here and actually cast their vote for the Reform Party candidate. Some ballots also were not punched, or were not completely punched, leaving what they referred to as dangling chads. The chads were the little pieces of the ballot that didn't punch cleanly. And so it really became no clear standard to determine the intent of the voter. I mean, if a ballot was punched all the way through, clearly that counted as a vote. If the ballot was not punched at all, there was no evidence that the voter had tried to cast a vote, then it's a non-vote. But what happens in between? And this picture here is really kind of one of my favorite pictures of the recounts. After the election on November 7th, the hand recount started in select Florida counties. And as you can see, this is kind of what it looked like. They were looking at these ballots and holding them up to the light and trying to see if there was any possible indication that a voter had intended to cast a vote. And like I said, it becomes very difficult because there isn't really a clear standard of what counts as a vote and what doesn't. And so quite literally, you had disagreements in some of these places where the recounts were going on because different people with different party alliances were there looking at these recounts and disagreeing over what constituted a vote and what did not. And the original deadline for the recounts was November 14th, but it was extended by the Florida Supreme Court until November 26th. Well, that date came and went. And this leads us then into December and Bush versus Gore. The battle over recounts persisted until on December 12th, the Supreme Court ruled that the recounts must stop. And the ruling was that basically that if they weren't able to complete full recounts by that date, then the original results had to stand. And so, since the recounts weren't complete, the original results stood. Bush was declared the winner, taking Florida. The inauguration. The president is sworn into office during an inauguration ceremony. The ceremony is attended by leaders from all three branches of government, and it is held in January following the election year. It's always held on January 20th. Section 3, the Cabinet. Selection of the Cabinet. The President must consider many factors in selecting the members of the Cabinet. The President must consider whether the potential Cabinet members' backgrounds suit their Cabinet posts, whether they are bringing geographical balance to the Cabinet, whether they will satisfy interest groups, whether they will have high-level administrative skills, and whether they include ethnic and racial minorities and women. Cabinet members today usually are college graduates and the leaders in various professional fields. The Senate must approve Cabinet appointees, and it usually does so out of courtesy to the president. So, rarely is there a case where a president makes a cabinet selection that is challenged by the Senate. Normally they will, even though technically they have to approve it, they normally will simply approve it. The role of the cabinet. Cabinet members are the heads of the executive departments. The cabinet's role has always been determined by the president. Modern presidents usually have not depended on the cabinet for advice and decision-making, but have turned to White House staff and close friends as their advisors. Certain cabinet members, the Secretaries of State, Defense, and Treasury, plus the Attorney General, form the inner cabinet and influence the president's decisions on matters related to their department's areas of interest. Factors limiting the cabinet's role. The president does not command the full loyalty of cabinet members, even though he appoints them. Cabinet members are pressured by career officials in their departments, interest groups, and members of Congress. This pressure may result in disagreements between the cabinet over the president's policies and plans. With 14 cabinet members, actually now it's 15, it is difficult to maintain secrecy in matters the president considers sensitive. The president may not know and trust all of the cabinet members, or all the members of the cabinet, because the president must weigh so many factors in appointing them. Section 4, the Executive Office. The Executive Office of the President, or the EOP, was created in 1939 by Congress. The EOP has grown rapidly for three reasons. Presidents keep adding new agencies to it as problems arise. Presidents want experts nearby to advise them about complex issues, and federal programs sometimes require special staff to coordinate the efforts of several executive departments and other agencies working together. More executive office agencies. The Office of Management and Budget, or OMB, is the largest agency in the EOP. It prepares the national budget that the President submits to Congress each year. The National Security Council advises the President and helps coordinate the nation's military and foreign policy. The Council of Economic Advisors helps the President formulate the nation's economic policy. Presidents add and sometimes eliminate agencies to the EOP to help carry out policy. The White House Office. If the President appoints White House staff without Senate confirmation, the White House office has become the most important part of the executive office of the President. The White House staff performs whatever duties the President assigns them, such as gathering information and providing advice on key issues, ensuring that the executive departments and agencies carry out key directives from the President, presenting the President's views to the outside world, and deciding who and what information gets through to the President. Chapter 9, Presidential Leadership. Our chapter objectives summarize the historical changes in the powers of the presidency, describe the 7 major roles of the President, and evaluate the leadership qualities important to the success of a president. Constitutional powers. The founders recognized the need for a strong executive branch to overcome weaknesses of the Confederation government and to hold the legislative branch in check. Article 2 grants the President broad but vaguely described powers. He heads the executive branch and is commander-in-chief, conducts foreign policy, and has judicial powers. Informal sources of power. Presidents have added to their powers by their actions. For example, Theodore Roosevelt declared his intent to do anything the needs of the nation required if such action was not expressly forbidden by the Constitution. During national crisis, presidents like Abraham Lincoln, Franklin D. Roosevelt, and George W. Bush greatly expanded the powers of the presidency as the federal government dealt with the dangers facing the United States. Modern presidents claim their ideas and policies represent a mandate from the people and they use all forms of mass media to build support for their ideas. Limits of presidential power. The Constitution gives Congress the power to limit presidential authority by overriding a veto or implementing and removing the president from office for a clear abuse of power. The federal courts also limit the president's power. The Supreme Court can overturn presidential actions, as it did President Truman in Youngstown Sheet and Tube versus Sawyer, 1952. The federal bureaucracy sometimes limits the presidential power by obstructing programs or failing to carry them out properly, especially when key bureaucrats work closely with powerful congressional leaders to carry out their own programs rather than the president's. Public opinion can limit the president's actions, as it did with President Lyndon Johnson's policies in Vietnam and President Clinton's proposed national health care program. And we're also, right now, we're kind of at a point where public opinion maybe kind of limits the president's power. The president has been seeking authorization from Congress to take action in the conflict in Syria because of allegations that the Syrian government has used chemical weapons against their own people. Well, public opinion is pretty much opposed to the use of military action. And as such, the president finds himself in a difficult spot. Yes, he does have the power. He could use military force even without congressional approval, but there's probably going to be a political consequence if he does that. So, public opinion can definitely influence the president's policies. The roles of the president. As the head of state, they represent the nation at ceremonial functions. It is considered to be more than a politician, but rather a symbol of the entire United States. As chief executive, he heads the 2 million person executive branch, influences how laws are executed through executive orders, presidential appointments, removal of appointed officials, and impoundment, grants pardons, reprieves, or amnesty. As chief legislator, proposes legislation to Congress, usually in the State of the Union address, must work harder for congressional support when Congress is controlled by the opposition party, may use political favors to gain congressional support, has the threat of the veto to influence Congress. For example, a president may tell members of Congress that they will not sign certain legislation or will only sign it if certain things are included. As economic planner, the president has gained important economic power since the New Deal. They promote high unemployment, production and purchasing power, and are required to prepare the federal budget each year. As party leader, helps to raise funds and plan campaign strategies, uses political patronage to appoint party members to government jobs. As chief diplomat, directs foreign policy and oversees foreign affairs information agencies, has sole power to make treaties with Senate approval, may make, without congressional approval, executive agreements having the force of treaties with foreign nations, and has the sole power to recognize foreign governments. As commander-in-chief, shares with Congress the power to wage war, makes key military policy decisions, supports war efforts on the home front during wars, may use the armed forces to end disorders or give aid in natural disasters. Section 3, Styles of Leadership. Increased responsibilities. Modern presidents have provided strong leadership for the nation, even though the founders expected Congress to lead the nation. Presidents provide leadership in introducing bold new ideas as well as responding to crises at home and abroad. Leadership qualities and skills. Presidents must know and understand the people of the United States. Presidents must be able to communicate effectively and to explain their policies clearly in order to inspire public support. Presidents must know when the time is right to introduce new policies or make key decisions. Successful presidents must be flexible and open to new ideas, be able to compromise, have political courage, and be willing to go against public opinion in matters that they believe are vital to the nation's interest. Isolated from the truth because people may not want to tell them the truth. The special treatment given to modern presidents risks isolating them from information and advice that they should have to carry out their duties effectively. Presidents may discourage staffers from disagreeing with them or giving them unpleasant advice. Access to the president often forces top staffers and advisors to flatter the president and provide only good news and favorable opinions. Top staffers control access to the president. Dealing with White House staff requires much of the president's time and makes it more difficult to keep in touch with the public. Executive privilege. To keep White House discussions and advice secret, presidents invoke executive privilege to avoid giving such information to Congress or the courts. So this is really the concept that a president's communications with their advisors and such are protected. Modern presidents have claimed that executive privilege also protects their communications with other members of the executive branch. The Supreme Court has ruled that executive privilege is constitutionally based. However, oftentimes when we see somebody trying to evoke executive privilege, oftentimes it is because they're suspected of doing something improper and they're trying to, cover their bases. For example, during the Watergate scandal that brought down Nixon, Nixon tried to claim executive privilege to protect the tapes that he had. He had a taping system installed in the Oval Office to help him write his memoirs when he left the presidency. And those tapes were subpoenaed by every group that was investigating Watergate. And so, as a result, it becomes a major liability for him because everybody wants those tapes knowing that they're out there. He tries to claim that executive privilege protects those tapes. Ultimately, he's forced by the courts to turn over the tapes. And the tapes reveal that he did approve a cover-up of the Watergate break-in, which ultimately led to Nixon facing impeachment charges in the House, and he resigned before the House ever proceeded with the impeachment hearing. But nonetheless, that's an example of where executive privilege has been used. Chapter 10, the Federal Bureaucracy. Our chapter objectives describe the functions of the Cabinet, independent government agencies, and regulatory commissions, evaluate the effectiveness of the civil service system, and summarize the advantages and disadvantages of the federal bureaucracy. Section 1, Bureaucratic Organization, the Cabinet Departments. The founders anticipated the need for federal agencies to carry on the daily business of government. Currently, nearly 3 million civilians work in the federal government. The 15 executive departments headed by cabinet rank officers are a major part of the federal bureaucracy. These departments are headed by secretaries and staffed with assistant secretaries, deputy secretaries, and directors of major units. 2 of the 4 departments created by Congress in 1789 are still among the most important, the departments of State and of the Treasury. The other 13 departments are the departments of the Interior, Agriculture, Justice, Commerce, Labor, Defense, Health and Human Services, Homeland Security, Housing and Urban Development, transportation, energy, education, and veterans affairs. Independent agencies. The federal bureaucracy includes over 100 independent organizations whose heads are appointed by the President. The service of several independent agencies, such as the National Aeronautics and Space Administration, or NASA, are widely publicized and are as large and as well known as cabinet departments. Some agencies, such as the Central Intelligence Agency and the General Services Administration, provide services directly for the executive branch. Government corporations are independent agencies that directly serve the public, such as the Federal Deposit Insurance Corporation and the United States Postal Service. Regulatory commissions are independent of all three branches of government, make rules for business and industries that affect the public interest, are often under intense pressures from the groups that they regulate and their lobbyists, have become more limited in their powers because critics have complained that they over-regulate the economy, and were the subject of regulatory reform by the Republican Congress in the mid-1990s. Section 2, the Civil Service System. Only 11% of all federal government employees work in Washington, D.C. Many federal employees work in offices throughout the United States and the world. Origins. Government jobs became a spoils system under President Andrew Jackson. And that literally means when you say a spoils system, you may have heard the expression, the spoils go to the victor. In this case, the victor was the president, who could award high-paying government jobs to people that were particularly loyal or helpful to the president. But the spoils system led to inefficiency and corruption in government. Calls for reform started in the 1850s. The assassination of President Garfield by a disappointed office seeker led to the Pendleton Act of 1883, establishing the present civil service system based on competitive examinations and merit. The civil service system today. Applicants for federal jobs are evaluated on the basis of their experience and training. Government jobs are attractive because they offer many benefits. Government workers, unlike most private sector workers, have job security and are difficult to fire. The Hatch Act of 1939 was intended to prevent political parties from using federal workers to aid in election campaigns. In recent years, critics have argued for and against this law, with workers now permitted some involvement in politics. Political appointees in government. Nearly 10% of the executive branch employees are appointed by the president, including many choice jobs. This allows the president to place loyal supporters in key offices. These political appointees are outside the civil service and are first and foremost the president's political supporters. Political appointees are not experts in the work of their agencies, and when the president leaves office, many of them return to private sector jobs. Many political appointees hold their positions for short tenures, making it hard for them to learn about their jobs, and as a result, much of the real power over daily operations remains in the hands of career officials. The bureaucracy at work, Section 3. Influencing policy. Policy consists of all the actions and decisions taken or not taken by the government. Federal bureaucrats carry out policy decisions made by the President and Congress. The bureaucracy often determines what the law means through the rules and regulations that it issues. In 1995, Congress set paperwork reduction goals for future years. Bureaucrats aid in shaping policy by helping Congress draft its new laws or by providing ideas for legislation. Workers in federal agencies shape policy by their decisions about the application of rules and regulations and by hearing disputes. Bureaucrats also supply advice and information to top decision makers, influencing whether an agency supports or opposes certain policies. The growth of the bureaucracy mirrors the growth of the nation's population and rapid changes in technology. The Cold War and international crises since World War II spurred the growth of the bureaucracy. The New Deal doubled the size of the federal government. Citizen special interest groups demanded various services and programs. Once created, government agencies almost never die. Influencing bureaucratic decisions. Congress has an important influence over bureaucrats. Congress can influence decision-making in federal agencies. Congress's main power over the bureaucracy is its control of the agency's budgets, also sometimes known as the power of the purse. Citizens may challenge agencies' actions in courts. The influence of client groups. Federal agencies have client groups that try to influence decisions. The close cooperation between congressional committees, client groups, and a federal agency or department is referred to as an iron triangle.